who may be viewed by many as being the classic bisexual. I am involved with a man and a woman. I live in two households. I consider both to be primary relationships. One relationship is with a white man, and the other is with a Filipino woman. For me, obviously, life, not to mention bisexuality, is a complex tapestry. And it's one that I choose not to unravel, for each thread has been woven to create the whole. But I'm here to speak about bisexuality, and hopefully to clarify just what that is. Bisexuality is simply, or not so simply, the ability to love and to be intimate with man and woman. Bisexuality is a sexual orientation, just as is homosexuality and heterosexuality. And it is a legitimate one. And most people tend to forget that. It has a history and it has a practice of its own. Now, one may choose to be intimate with, or a combination of individuals, a single individual for whatever duration, in whatever space and time. But these factors are all present in other sexual orientations, not just particular to bisexuality. Bisexuality, as a positive force in our society, has been obscure. Bisexuality has been invisible for the most part due to other people's stereotyping of us, and also by the burying of bisexuality in other movements. Now, the issue of bisexuality is not one that I immediately embraced with open arms or gravitated to. I bought into some of the negative connotations that other people imposed upon us. Other people feel the necessity to label us, and by labeling, pigeonholing who we as individuals are. And I feel that I need to get over the labeling, to address all the aspects of my life. It becomes critical for me not to allow others to segregate me as being an Asian, or a Pacific Islander, or a woman, or a bisexual. I am all of those, and I must define myself. It's too dangerous not to. To allow others to define us, and therefore condemn us, of using their community, of receiving heterosexual perks, denies the contributions of bisexuals to movements, but also gives those people the power of naming. And it's a real power that you give away when you allow someone else to define who you are. I get told repeatedly in the media by funders, whomever I may be addressing, that Asians are the quote-unquote golden minority. Now, if I bought into this, not only would I be thinking that I was better than other groups of color, but by virtue of being a quote-unquote minority, I would never be as good as a white person. And I'd be stuck in this false state of limbo. Similarly, bisexuals can't buy into other people's notions of who we are, and that bisexuality is better than or less than homosexuality or heterosexuality. Now, I have also often heard people say, as I'm sure you have, that they don't know if their sexuality changes, depending upon their partner, that day, that night, that week, that month. But wouldn't it be easier and a lot nicer to just say that you were bisexual, which is a constant and truer state of being? A chameleon is, after all, a chameleon, even though it changes its colors. Now, if I were to absolve one of my relationships today and decide to be monogamous for the rest of my life with that individual, I would still be a bisexual, because I would still have the ability to love and be intimate with an individual man or woman. The other method, or at least one other method, of obscuring bisexuality is through other movements. Specifically, as a woman and one of color, I have given more attention to other movements. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movement have all been focal points for my professional and political struggles. In some ways, it's not as difficult due to the past groundwork laid for a person of color to recognize racial oppression, or for a woman to see sexual inequality, or for a gay and lesbian to see the prejudice imposed on one for being homosexual. But for a bisexual, guilt of being a bisexual comes into play. And that's the guilt of passing, of not being seen as being politically correct, of being suspect in the gay community. And so bisexuality has been trivialized by both external and internal forces, and it has remained, for the most part, up until fairly recently, invisible. For a woman of color to pick her fights, and those fights are many, it has often made more sense to fight for people with AIDS, the end of apartheid, reproductive rights and safeguards, and against institutions like the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The thing to remember is that whatever battles we choose to fight for, we must also bear in mind that along with all the other movements, we are part of a bisexual movement. And I dare say that bisexuality is a movement. Because not only have we experienced the feelings and actions of prejudice and discrimination, but we as individuals and collectively have worked to recondition the way people's attitudes and stereotypes are and have been. The fact that it's anticipated that 500 people will sign up for this conference is a statement that bisexuality is a movement. A claiming and a validation of an identity. But as a movement, we must also recognize it is a fledgling one that can't be taken for granted and one that has to be fought for. For those of us already involved in working to end other forms of discrimination, it's crucial to make our movements responsible to all of its constituents, and we are those constituents. There are, of course, numerous ways and methods of bringing bisexuality to the fore. Sometimes, and for some individuals, it is the sit-down drag-out fights. At other times, it is not the beating down of doors or over confrontations, but rather just simply living one's life, which in our society is no easy task. When I became involved with the creation of Asian Pacifica Sisters, a local San Francisco grassroots organization that's comprised of Asian Pacific, lesbian, and bisexual women, a little over 2 years ago, I never said that the organization had to be bisexual. I also didn't hide the fact that I was involved with both genders and intended to remain so. Now, I had spoken to individual members about my lifestyle and noted with a certain amount of satisfaction and relief when they were somewhat surprised that I didn't seem like a confused individual. So when the time came to decide whether bisexuals should be included as members to the organization, other lesbians, not I, took up the struggle for inclusion. Now, it probably didn't hurt that they had already chosen me to be president of the organization. Or that they didn't want to lose a free attorney to wade the morass. But what they probably also didn't recognize on a subconscious level was that Asian Pacifica Sisters was a new and fledgling organization, similar to the bisexual movement. And every individual's energies were needed to move that organization forward. Nevertheless, the decision to include bisexuals, however begrudgingly given by some, was taken up not by me, who was then the only out bisexual in the group, but by other people who bought into the notion that we as bisexuals should be and need be included in all movements. A relatively easy battle, this one. Of course, this doesn't preclude the other battles, which have been rougher. When I have been defensive, ranted and raved over other people's stereotypes and myopia, brooded over and yes, even ignored the internal biphobia, discrimination against bisexuals. And I have fought over my decision, as I'm sure those of you out there have, with friends, lovers, and mere acquaintances. But despite the isolation, for even in Asian Pacifica Sisters and other groups that recognize bisexuals, you still have to struggle or you'll remain invisible. There is also celebration. And often the celebration is often with those very individuals with whom you have taken up the struggle with. Okay. The celebration is for space, a space where we can be free to live our lives without prejudice.
Our poet for this evening, she's an African-American Jewish poet and writer, single, mother of 2 sons, student of psychology. Ladies and gentlemen, from Richmond, California, will you please welcome Dajenya.
This next poem is by Irene Wolt, and it starts with this quote. I like loving. I like mostly all the ways anyone can have of having loving feeling in them. Slowly it has come to be in me that any way of being a loving one is interesting and not unpleasant to me. Gertrude Stein. Just because I made that wonderful, glorious leap to love women does not mean I have lost the capacity to love men.
Okay. I'm Fritz Klein. I live now in San Diego for 8 years, originally from New York. I'm the author of The Bisexual Option, and I co-edited a book called Bisexuality, Theory and Research. When I did my research on bisexuality, there was no such thing as BIPOL, there was no such national organization. I came to this conference expecting it to be a very small contingent of people. Instead, I find that there actually are people from all over the United States, 300 strong, and a budding national organization, which has been a delightful surprise, considering that when I did the research, no such thing, nothing at all. What else did you talk about, want me to talk about?
What issues within the realm of the arena of bisexuality, what issues do you think are most important to be addressing, not only for people who are bisexual, but to the public at large in terms of relating or communicating?
Yeah. Well, I think I still think the myth that bisexuality does not exist, or if it does exist, you're either neurotic or a traitor, is still the prevalent thought in the United States, both in the heterosexual community and in the homosexual lesbian community. And I think these are the issues that have to be addressed, especially in the gay lesbian communities. And this is being done now for the first time. So I think the education is probably the most important role of a national organization, in addition to, of course, political. But from the background that I come from, as being a psychiatrist, I deal much more on an educational level than I do on a political level. So the political situation, I personally will leave to other people. The educational, I think, is extremely important, and I see that in terms of new books coming out, new articles being written, more research is being done. Still a trickle, but it is much more than it was 10 years ago.